Alright guys, it's time to talk terminal blocks. Now, working on these wires, working on different terminal ends, takes a little bit of practice. Just take your time with it and we'll make sure we get it right. So, it doesn't matter if we're working on cable ends, on the backs of motors, on the backs of Pentpaks. There's really two different type of connectors that we're going to work on today. We're going to work on our high voltage connectors and we're going to work on our low voltage connectors, and I'm going to show you the tips and tricks to get these right the first time. I use a pair of needle nose, a pair of wire cutters, a large flat blade, a 2.5 millimeter flat blade, and this is an important animal. Make sure you have one of these in your toolbox, and I'll show you why that's so important in a little bit. A 3 millimeter or 4 millimeter hex, some Loctite 518 to seal everything up. Everyone uses some good dielectric grease for keeping everything watertight, and a mallet or a hammer just to get stuff apart. Alright, so those tools are going to be used for about everything that we're talking about today. It doesn't matter if we're doing cables, if we're talking about motors, Pentpaks. Basically, the technique's going to be the same. So I'm on a cable end right here, and this is the female side of the cable end. Let's take it apart. Let's show you what the inside of this box should look like, and I'll give you some of those tips that we're talking about. I'm going to start by taking the caps out of the back of this cable end. And then I'm going to use a 3 millimeter hex to take the screws out of the top of the box and get it apart. Now as we're taking this apart, notice there's a washer on each one of these Allens. Try not to lose them. If you tap this box just a little bit, a lot of times it'll pop apart a little bit easier, especially depending on how much Loctite you used last time you put it together. Now as we have our box apart, you can see about what the Loctite looks like. I take my time and I clean this up. I remove all the old Loctite, so when I put it back together, I got a nice, tight, watertight seal. The tighter you make this area, the better that gasket is that's going to keep corrosion from entering the back of your cables. So on the female side of this plug, we've got a gasket. Again, on the male side, we've got an O-ring. Make sure you remove this, inspect it, make sure it's still in good shape. If you need another one, just call customer service and we'll get it to you. Let's talk about the high voltage connectors first. Now these connectors are a little bit different than what you're used to using. On the face of this connector, we're going to use a 4 millimeter hex. Insert it into the face of the connector and twist it. There's a cone on the inside of this connector. That cone is actually the crimping tool that's going to clamp down and hold that wire where you want it to be. Now, again, cable management, it's a big deal. The other thing that I found really successful is the amount of wire that you leave on the end of these wires once you cut them back and start them fresh and clean. Some guys like to use a lot of rat's nest wire at the end. It's a lot to maintain, and it's a lot of fray inside of this little box. So about a ½ inch or so on most of these connectors really seems to work well. When you insert the wire, when you've got it nice and clean and tight, and you've just removed your insulation and shielding, insert it directly into the back of the connector and push it firmly. Hold it there while you tighten the front of the connector down using that 4 millimeter wrench. You'll feel it get tight and feel it get snug. It's a little bit easier when it's in a vise than holding it in my hand. When I tighten it down, the inside of that connector isn't going anywhere. There's no loose wires around the outside of it. Everything's connected and protected. Now I'm going to take some dielectric grease, I'm going to fill the inside of this to keep any moisture, keep any corrosion from growing. Now, superstar secret. If you notice, we've got an L1, L2, L3, and a neutral wire inside of this high voltage connector. Make sure they're in the same order. What I recommend is take one wire out at a time and reinstall it into the next connector. If you do that, you won't confuse L1, L2, L3, and the ground, and you won't have to send your machine back to the pros to get it working again. Alright, so we've talked about our high voltage connectors and our low voltage connectors, and it's time to close everything back up. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a cable end or a motor. Again, using some Loctite 518 and making sure that that waterproof gasket that we're going to create is important. So before we put it back together, I'm going to apply some 518 around the keyway areas of the housing. I'm going to give one last visual inspection before I close this back up to make sure that no wires are hanging out, that I filled all my holes with dielectric grease, and I've kept everything as tight as I can. Now, assuming your keyways are correct when you put everything back together, the box should snap back together just as easy as it came apart. Notice on these connectors, there's a large keyway and a small keyway. It's important that you make sure that all those keyways line up, otherwise your box won't fit back together tight. I'm going to put my screws back in, my gaskets back in, my caps back on, and get this cable back ready for service. If you guys have any questions, give us a call at our service department. We'd love to help you get through it. The link's below, contact information is below. Good luck, guys. Alright, we're going to talk low voltage connectors here for just a second. I'll tell you, this is our #1 phone call for our service department because either the order of the wires went wrong or we just aren't making good connections. So I want to show you the tips and tricks to make sure that we get these things done right. So this is our pretty standard 5-pin connector. There's 4 wires in the back of it. Whenever you're replacing these connectors, again, they get used, they get worn out, so you're going to replace these in the field. I always recommend lining your connectors up side by side. You may not be on a bench vise, but put your connectors next to one another. That 2.5mm screwdriver that we talked about needed, it's an important tool right here. When we take a look at how these connectors work, there's a wire and there's a clamp or a jaw in them. We're going to insert that 2.5mm screwdriver all the way down to the bottom where it's seated and apply just a little bit of leverage and release that wire. Now, if we take that wire out of the connector that's bad and we place it directly in the corresponding location on the new connector, we're not going to confuse the order of the wires of the operation. So you watch as I do this, it only takes a matter of seconds to replace each wire from one connector to the other. Every time I replace a connector, I make sure, both visually and by pulling on it, to make sure I have a good, solid, positive connection in those jaws. It's very important that the wires are all the way down, seated in the bottom of the connector. There's no wires exposed, and everything goes back in the corresponding place. After I replace the wire in the new connectors, I'm going to fill these holes with dielectric grease before I reassemble.